So hello everyone. My name's Richard Shephard. I'm a veterinary agricultural consultant, and I've done a bit of work in the climate change space. And I'm actually an academic associate of the Primary Institute Climate Challenge Centre at the University of Melbourne. So I've had a little bit to do with these GAF tools, or Greenhouse Accounting Framework tools. Mainly from the point of view of working with farmers and the end users. So what I would like to do today is to talk in general terms about what these tools do and what they don't do, and some of the tricks of the trade for entering data into one of the tools. And we're going to be using a beef farm as an example because livestock systems are a little more complicated than cropping systems because you have to work out your livestock inventory, and that can be quite challenging. So the basic process is the calculator's got its introductory screen here, and it also has a data summary screen, which is the output. And this is a very important page for people to come to at regular intervals when they're entering their data. Because one thing about spreadsheets, especially a spreadsheet like this, and this is one of the more complex spreadsheets I've ever seen, is that they're quite easy to break. If you actually break a link, you come back to this screen, you will see an error in that screen. So if you keep coming back regularly and checking it, you can easily roll back to see where the mistake is. Don't do 2 hours work, go there and realise that step one, you broke it, because you'll have to do some pretty major forensics to sort it out. So encourage the users to always come back and check this. And if they see the screen is working correctly, then hit the save button, for example, so save a version of it all. So what we're going to do today in the exercise, it's a beef herd that we will enter. And you've got in the workshop notes, you've got a set of notes that describes the farm. And so here's the basic input sheet for the beef producer. All the GAF tools have been designed the same way in the fact that any of the white coloured cells are designed for data entry. Anything that's shaded out or has colour in it either is for a label or a description, or even more importantly, for an equation. So if you look at this station, I'll put the cell in for how many bulls have we got in spring. You'll notice that it's the number 8 that is highlighted there, and in the context up here, there's a number 8 there. There are other cells here like these ones that'll have an equation in it. So the thing to make sure that your producers do and your users do is, if they're not sure about whether they should enter something in the cell, is look up into the equation bar, and if they see an equation, run like hell. Get out of it. This section here is coloured this way because if you're technically across everything, you may manually override these, but I think in most situations it's not a good thing to do. So the first steps for the farm are, and how the spreadsheets work is they are driven by these input cells basically calculate how much feed is eaten on the farm in a single year. And it's based to the simple equation that is being developed in Australia, that for every kilogram of dry matter eaten, a certain amount, I think it's 20.7 grams of methane are produced. So all this calculation does is work out how many kilograms of dry matter are eaten on the farm. Plus one extra thing, it says how much product did you produce? So when did you sell all your animals and how heavy were they? And that determines your intensity. So you have the two things. How much feed did they eat? How many kilograms of beef did I make? One divided by the other will give you your intensity. So you can make mistakes if you forget to sell animals or all those sorts of things. Okay. So the trick is to work through from the top down. And the other thing that they do is they work via a series of lookup tables. I'll give you an example of a classic one here that they should be aware of. You put in your data entry where you're from, you've got to choose your state. And obviously you have to choose a state. Now I've picked Victoria, of course, for this one. You will notice as you scroll down the bottom, in some of the ones you get other things here, like how often do you have a fire season, and it can calculate your control burning sort of emissions reductions. They do not work based on the fact that you've entered Victoria. So you can see some anomalous things in the spreadsheets occasionally. The most important thing is that you say where you are, what state you're in, is your tropic north property north of the Tropic of Capricorn. Pretty hard to be in Victoria north of the Tropic of Capricorn. But you need to answer these questions correctly because it influences a lot of the lookup tables that are behind the scenes. So make sure people don't just race to entering in their cattle numbers, but they literally start at the top of every spreadsheet and work your way down. And that is the best rule they can provide. Now, in the example, you see we've given description about the size of the farm, the number of farms, and the type of stock they've had. It looks very simple on paper, but one of the challenges is to get the livestock numbers correct as they go through the seasons. So that's the livestock inventory, and it requires a little bit of skill to be able to do that. Not so hard for things like the bulls. You always have 8 bulls, and then you might sell a couple and buy a couple, but that's easy. But for your cows and your heifers, as your heifers grow, they'll change from being a heifer to becoming a cow themselves. So you've got to get these numbers right. A little bit of homework before you start's not a bad idea. So the other thing is that people can get a little bit fixated on the fact that they say calve in the autumn and then they don't carry any cattle over they'll sell them on at a certain point in time. This is the best way to look at these sets of numbers is if you do that, this is a combination of this year's progress, so autumn and winter is progress, but also their last year's animals in that same age class. So yes, let's just say you bought some calves were born in the autumn and you had 80 of them in the winter, but last year, just in the spring before that winter, you had last year's calves there in that age category. And so often you'll find producers will enter 80, 80 and nothing for those 2 dates. They're thinking of the production year. You've got to look at the year. In spring of the year that's just passed, there were 80 steers on the farm. Okay, so that's what you put in there. You're not trying to account perfectly for individual cohorts of animals passing through. That takes a bit of a challenge to do, but it can be done. And I recommend that you, to the right of the spreadsheet in some of these clearer cells, you can actually do some of the calculations yourself. And the reason that you need to do that is the next stage is actually a little more challenging than getting the numbers right. It's working out your average live weights. You can do that easily for the adults, but for the younger stock that are growing, it's quite challenging. And it's a bit like end of financial year stuff, opening numbers and closing numbers. So this wants to know the average live weight for the month. So if I've got calves that are born at, say, 35 kilos, and at the end of spring they might be 65 kilos or 50 kilos, then their average is going to be the number of those two. It's quite difficult to work through and make sure all these averages add up and give you sensible weights. So this is another reason you can do for spring opening numbers, closing numbers, and divide the number by 91 days in a season to work out your average weights and make sure that they all add up. So by getting this bit correct, you'll then be able to calculate these live weight gains. And one of the tricks in this, the GAF tool, is that this is live weight kilograms of live weight kilograms per head per day. So if to go from 45 to 140 kilos, I've got to put on about 100 kilos over about 90 days, etc. So the calculations need to work backwards from there. And you'll see here in the summer, for example, these steers went from 140 kilos, an average of 140 kilos in the summer from an average of 45 before. So they put on about 100 kilos in about 100 days. So that's about roughly correct. But the best way to do that is to not try and do it all in your head here, but to use some of the blank cells in the spreadsheet to get this to work out. And if you make a table of opening numbers, closing numbers, number of days and averages, you can work those things through. Now, we saw in these equations, which is the crude protein of the pastures and the dry matter digestibility, these are sort of grayed out. For most users, just stick to the default values. These numbers will change based on whichever drop-down list that you pick and on your rainfall. So these will change according to the combinations you put up here. They're putting this off color here so that if you know your individual stuff, you've done feed tests, you can override it. I have never worked with a producer yet that's overridden those basic numbers. And then you put in your inventories. number of head you buy, you've got to put in the number of animals you buy as well. For example, if you contract rear steers or something, or you're gist, because they're eating dry matter on your property and they're generating methane. So account for them down here in this section here, which is your traded cattle especially. These are the animals that you buy in and sell out, and you've got to get these numbers correct here. In the example I've given you, there are none. And if you buy animals, you've also got to tell them what district they came from. And because they take different amounts of time to grow in different regions, then you need to account for where you bought them from, because they come in with a different set of already embedded emissions, scope 3s. This is working at the scope 3s in the animals you buy. And then critically for your intensity is you need to work out how many of these animals you sell for beef that leave your property. So, you know, this time I'm selling 2 bulls, I'm selling all the steers, I've got 40 cull cows, and I've got 40 heifers that I didn't keep as replacements that I'm solving, and that'll give you your total amount of beef that you've sold, which will determine your intensity. So it's important to get this row of details correct as well. Also important to get your splits roughly right between your percentage of cows calving. These numbers should add to 100% because we're talking about cows that actually do calve, okay? And the rest of it is pretty easy to enter now. It's just basically nominal numbers that you have from your records. It's a lot easier if producers come to these sessions with having done their homework and bringing their raw data in, because otherwise they have to put placeholders in here. So you put in urea induces emissions, and urea comes with embedded fertilizer. So there's another trick here is often you'll see, why am I doing nitrogen fertilizer and urea separately? And the reason being is the nitrogen fertilizers all can produce nitrous oxide when applied as a fertilizer, but urea also comes with a markedly higher level of embedded emissions. So you need to separate those two out into your scope 1s and scope 2s and scope 3s. This energy stuff is pretty basic and defaults to what you have for your annual year. Not much needed to worry about that. The other thing that often causes a bit of trouble is this is for herbicides and pesticides. The measure is kilograms of active ingredient per enterprise. Most farmers just buy drums of Roundup, etc., and equivalent. If they don't know those numbers directly, a general and rough rule of thumb is that half the litrage you buy, therefore half the kilograms you buy, is active. But you can refine them down the track, okay? Get them all sorted out here. And you'll see I've entered that I'm in Victoria. So this whole section down here in Savannah Burnie is blocked out from the spreadsheet, from the calculations. So don't worry about that. If you're in a southern state or in a southern part of the state, only worry about Savannah Burnie if you're in the north and it's eligible for you. So there's a couple of quirks here that can make people stub their toe when they go through this. Typically, it takes about 40 minutes to an hour to work with a group of producers and to get their data to the point that they're happy with it, or to know which data they've got to check and go through down the track. So the point of the exercise then is, once the data is entered, is that you can then go back to the data summary page and see your emissions. In this case, we've got some data that's based on my stuff. And for many producers, this is the number that their banks may want or their supply chain may want. And so this can provide them with that tool or with that output. However, what I've done with this workshop more is to encourage producers to look at what are the drivers of emissions on their farm. And so you will see that once they've entered their baseline number and they've got their answer, which is a very good effort in itself, is we've got a series of exercises where they can say, now let's assume I get a few more calves out of those cows. And you go and change your scenario and see what happens. And another one is if I say, if I can grow those steers a little bit bigger and a few extra kilos on those steers, what does it do? And in final scenarios, you combine the two. If I had improved fertility and better growth rates in my steers, what does it do? You will see a classic pattern from all of those is that the farm emissions will go up, but the emissions intensity will go down. And that's a very important lesson for the producers to understand, is that they can actually manipulate their emissions intensity, which is what they talk to their supply chain with at the moment, is the intensity of their production. So the more efficient and the better they become, they will lower their intensity, but paradoxically, their farm emissions will go up because you've got this classic economic response of you're getting more out of less, but you're actually producing more emissions. So that's a really good lesson for them to learn. And it's a very good exercise to make this spreadsheet become more usable for the producer in their own business. However, it's also very important to emphasize to them is this is just looking at greenhouse gases and emissions intensity and drivers of it all. And so whilst I say put a few extra kilos on those steers and lower your emissions, improve the fertility of your cows and lower your emissions, it doesn't say whether you can feasibly do that or whether it's cost effective to do that. So the other lesson here for the producers is it's a very powerful tool at understanding where their emissions are coming from, but it doesn't tell them if it's a business sensible thing for them to do. That requires other pieces of information. So in your workshop notes, you'll see I've gone through a series of examples of where farmers commonly stub their toes when entering this data and some of the mistakes that you can make, and hopefully they'll be able to see that. And another experiment that they can and should do is they should play with their trees. Once they've got their raw data entry, put in the tree exercise and see how a tree impacts on them over time. Now, the other trick to filling in the vegetation screen is this is just a series of extremely complicated lookup tables, and they are hierarchically organized. So what I pick in the first box influences the lookup for the second box, which influences the lookup for the third box. So that the critical message is always start from the top and always work your way down to the bottom, and don't just change one thing, because if it tries to find a combination that doesn't exist in the database, you'll get an error message. So it's most exemplified in the tree section is you always start at the top, and you always, no matter what, if you change one thing, always start at the top and work your way down, make sure all the links are intact and play with it, okay? And you can have up to 4 different tree plantings. Just set the hectares to 0 in the ones that you aren't using. But once you have it working, what you would then encourage the producers to do is say, right, I planted the trees 5 years ago. What difference does it make? I'll change that to 5 years. We'll go back to the data summary, and you can see our carbon sequestration in trees is 51. If I go to the trees and I make them 15 years old, back to the data summary, and you can see that the tree sequestration is changing, and you can walk through that until you get to say let's say they're 99 years old in Queensland or somewhere like that, if you were there, 99 years old, and you go back to the summary and you can see the trees have almost reached maturity. So the lesson for this is to show that whilst trees are very good at sequestering carbon, they'll start off at nothing, they'll increase a lot of sequestration, and then they'll flatten out again. And so the only way that trees in the long term in a consistent production system provide you with sufficient offsets is if you keep putting more of your land into trees. That's a lesson that they can learn through doing those sorts of experiments. So other questions that you can get is where's the soil component of the GAF tool? The soils component was deliberately left out of these GAF tools because it works under the assumption that most farmers are in a steady state production system. And so whilst their soil carbon may go up and down, it just oscillates around an average for their district. Now, if they got out of cropping and went into beef, etc., or something, or put pasture of it, yes, then they could expect their soil carbon to go up. But the GAF tool is not designed to do that, because you would have to go from the beef GAF tool to the cropping GAF tool, and they don't sort of talk to each other individually. This is looking at individual enterprises on their own. So if you have people coming into your course, especially those from regenerative agriculture, they'll often ask you, where's the soil carbon? The reason it's not been put in is that this mostly talks to commercial producers in a steady state situation. And so over time, your soil carbon changes, it won't change so much. So if when you do this, you've got farmers who can complete the process and put their raw data in and can then actually play a bit of what I call it what-if scenarios by changing the performance of their farms to understand the drivers of their farming emissions profile and work out what are the levers that they can have. using their brain and discussions with their farming family and perhaps and also their advisors, and then understand the role of trees and how trees can provide some form of relief over time, then you've achieved a lot with that group, and that I regard as a success. And so, whilst it sounds like there's not much to do, that can easily occupy a few hours of time and stimulate a lot of good questions. And so, I've written this tutorial and workshop to be able to take up a couple of hours of solid thinking time and a little bit more with some group discussions. So one other thing I would say that I've written in the notes, but I think it's very important, if a farmer comes into one of these workshops and they've got a Mac, Macs are very prone to breaking the links in the spreadsheet. So really it's got to be a Microsoft, it's got to be done in Excel, and ideally Excel on a Windows box. I've seen so many break it. And the most thing, if they're going to do it in an Excel on a Mac, keep going back to the data summary screen, because they will break in the most unusual ways. And if they do break it, the other thing is, if this farmer has broken the spreadsheet, but they've got really concentrated on their data input, all is not lost. Just print out that sheet of data entry numbers and go into a clean version of the spreadsheet and just focus on putting the numbers into those white cells, and you will get it all back. So all is not lost, but I've spent a lot of time doing spreadsheet forensics. Something about farmers and fat fingers and keyboards and spreadsheets, they can break them, I can tell you. So anyway, it happens a lot, and I wish it didn't, but if you break it, all is not lost. You've got your raw numbers there. The other thing I would also recommend that farmers do especially is you put your numbers in and you're spending a lot of time and you're concentrating on doing this, and you put a number in a box. You may then use this spreadsheet again in 12 months' time when you come back to do it again. You'll look at the number in one of the cells that you entered last year and you go, why did I put that number there? So there's plenty of, you can add a blank spreadsheet into the GAF tool, and you can make some notes. I entered 600 for nitrogen because I bought 2 years worth of it, or something like that. You know, just write some explanatory notes, because this obviously relies on honesty in your entry of data, and the last thing you want it to do is to fool yourself as well. So if you make notes as to your assumptions and why you did it, you know, and I think that, you know, I entered only 15 kilos of growth over that season because they grew very poorly. When you come back in a year's time, you go, why did I enter 15? I normally get 80 kilos of growth in the season, you remember. And then you'll actually have some power in your data, in your numbers there when you go back to use them. So I encourage everyone when they do it to write some notes about why they entered stuff in, not the non-contentious stuff, but the stuff where they think I might get confused in a year's time. All this empowers the farmer and the producer to understand that this is a tool that's working for them, not, you know, they're filling it in slavishly to give to somebody else because they're getting harassed for it. I think if they walk away from this understanding the drivers of their production, what are the levers that they can pull, and some idea about what the next step might be if I got paid for it, or what I could expend to do the next step, then it's really done its job, really done its job well. Start off on the right step now. Write down your reasoning why, you know, all that sort of stuff. It's really good lessons to be able to do that. And because I have been in situations where farmers have come in and said, look, we did this last year, but I can't remember why we put that number there. No good, is it? So then you get your year. Have you got better or worse? You don't know what that number was, whether it was a mistake or you did it deliberately. And so to become a powerful tool, you've got to trust your numbers that you've entered, even if you don't tell anyone. Your last thing you want this to do is to fool yourself. You want it to help yourself in saying, am my emissions going up? Are they going down? And if you've got confidence in your numbers, then it'll do that. And so I'd like to think this is a tool for producers to better understand how their farm works. And other people might want to use the data, but if you can walk away from this knowing that you've got a better understanding of your farm, then I reckon it's done its job. That's what I like to see happen. Yes, you can give it to the banks and then maybe they'll go away. They won't give you a percentage off your interest rates, though, I don't think. But one day they might. And you might need to have that validated data ready to go.